Okay, so hello. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Erica Ostrander, and if you don't know me, I'm currently the director of the CSUN Art Galleries. And it's my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce to you today David S. Rubin, who is actually a San Fernando Valley native, which makes this presentation, at least for me, since I grew up in the Valley, extra special because it's always wonderful to hear from people who grew up in the Valley. So David holds an AB in philosophy from the University of California, Los Angeles, and an MA in art history from Harvard University. He's been exhibiting his automatic drawing since 2003, and he's shown both nationally and internationally, and his work is in numerous private collections. David has also been an active figure in the contemporary arts field as a writer, curator, and critic for over 40 years, and is currently a regular contributor to the online journal Visual Arts Source. And he has worked in museums all over the country, which he will tell you a little about during his presentation. In May 2017, David actually returned to Los Angeles to continue his work as an independent curator, writer, and artist. A full bio for him can be found on our website, csun.edu/art galleries, so you can dive into his background a little further. But without further ado, may I introduce to you David Rubin, or David S. Rubin.
Oh, you can call me either, but in print I like the S. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I want to first acknowledge former gallery director Jim Sweeters, who gave me the initial invitation to have this exhibition at CSUN. And of course, I want to thank Erica and her crew of students for doing a fantastic job in getting everything up and running. So I'm going to present a PowerPoint. So let me go to share screen. And okay, why isn't it launching? I had this problem the other day. Slideshow, no. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So as Erica said, I'm actually not a native of the Valley. I'm a native of Los Angeles, but I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in the 1950s and 60s. And that was certainly a great time to be growing up in the Valley, post-war baby boom. Like most Valley kids in suburbia, I watched a lot of television, watched Lucy and saw the Beatles when they made their debut appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. The photo in the background is of the Valley from around 1960, by the way. So I showed artistic inclinations early on when I was in the 6th grade, living in Studio City. I remember one night we were watching TV and I drew a portrait of my mom, and everybody thought it was great because it looked like her. And also as a child, I remember in the 50s, there was an arts and crafts store in Studio City called Ideas Unlimited. And my mom took us there to make mostly mosaic ashtrays and things like that. And I also went to summer camp in those years at a place called the Lazy J Ranch in Canoga Park, where we made lanyards and pot holders and crafty things of that nature. So that's my early roots. So in the early 1970s, while I was still an undergraduate at UCLA, my mom encouraged me to go take a painting class at a frame shop in Encino. And so the still life that you see there, I painted, I guess during the summer I was living at home in Encino. And oil painting really didn't catch my interest to any great degree, but my mom kept the painting, I have it now. And then a few years later, my mom opened a needlepoint store, and we collaborated actually on the work on the right. I designed it mostly using images that I took from Jansen's History of Art, which was our standard textbook at the time for art history classes. And then of course my mom stitched it. And as I mentioned, my mom hired me to be her artist in residence at her needlepoint store, where I designed mostly Judaica and dog portraits and things of that nature, and some of my own designs, My mom was an expert craftsperson, and there are some of the pillows that she made and Afghans. And one of the things that I realized in hindsight only a few years ago, that the process in my drawings when I draw, I have real affinities with the way my mother did her needlework and her knitting and her needle pointing. She would always work kind of up close, and she would work module to module. And when I'm doing my drawings, the largest I work is 19 by 24 inches because I can still work on my lap. So it's a very intimate process. I'm very close to what I'm doing. So after UCLA, I went off to graduate school to study at Harvard University. When I was at UCLA, basically I got into, oh, I made a typo, sorry about that. Abstract is missing the A, okay. So when I was in an undergrad, I was taking art history for fun because I loved the slide comparison method. And I took a class in Chinese art history where on our midterm exam, we had an unknown. We had learned the stylistic basis for dating ancient bronzes. And so the question was, you were the museum curator, should you purchase it or not? And I said, the museum should not buy it because it's a fake. I was the only student in the class of 150 who got that it was a fake for stylistic reasons. And so my professor told me I had an eye, and I ended up going to Harvard. He wanted me to study Japanese art, but once I got there, I fell in love with modern art. And by the time I was ready to embark on a topic for a thesis, I proposed automatism, well, something on the New York school, and I settled on automatism and the origins of abstract expressionism. And I got very interested in a small group of artists, all of whom, of course, were very important artists in art history. The Chilean surrealist Roberto Mata Echeran was holding group automatic drawing sessions at his apartment on the Upper East Side in New York. And among those who attended were William Baziotis, Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, and a couple of lesser known artists, Jerome Kamrowski and Peter Busa. And they would draw together, and in fact, the work on the right there is a painting, a collaborative painting that was made by Kamrowski, Baziotis, and Pollock together when they were experimenting with new techniques in the early 1940s. So the three artists, though, that I really honed in on were Motherwell, Baziotis, and Pollock. I was working on a PhD on this topic, although I never completed it for reasons I'll mention in a minute. But Motherwell, what I learned was there were different approaches to automatic drawing. When we talk about automatic drawing, we're talking about working very spontaneously, where you really don't have an image in your head as to what you're going to draw. You're just going to do it and let it kind of unfold organically. With Motherwell, it became a kind of process of spontaneity and control. His most famous configuration, this bar and ovoid imagery that you see here, started with some doodles, which he then blocked out with a more conscious move. So it was an alternating process of doing something spontaneous, sometimes blocking it out, and maybe making another spontaneous mark and so on, which led to his most important body of work. Baziotis was known for what was called slow automatism. His hand was very slow and steady as opposed to very quick like some of the others. And you can kind of see that in the imagery that he developed, working very slowly on canvas, but very steadily, almost as in a trance. And one of the interesting things about Baziotis was that he was interested in the hours of the day, which was actually one of the topics that Mata had these artists explore. He had them do what he called directed automatism, where you think of a topic, but you draw very spontaneously. Male and female was another topic. In any case, Baziotis was a dawn and dusk person. That's when he liked to make art, was at dawn and dusk, because he felt that that was the time when his subconscious was most in touch, or that his psyche was most in touch with the collective unconscious. So I summed up my research, at least on Pollock and some of the others, in an article I published in Arts Magazine in 1979, a national magazine. It was an all Pollock issue. I really felt quite honored. At the time, I was teaching at Scripps College, teaching art history at Scripps College in Claremont, and I was also the assistant director of the galleries of the Claremont colleges. And one of the things that interested me was that you could sometimes actually make out imagery within Pollock's web of dripped paint and lines. And so there's a little one there that I show you, which was part of what I used to make my case. Now, in order to know this much about Pollock, I interviewed his widow, Lee Krasner, who was a very important artist in her own right. She was there when Pollock and the others were at Mata's apartment doing automatic drawing sessions at group, but she wasn't allowed to participate because she was a woman. And in those days, women, of course, were not allowed, they weren't given the status that men were. So she was supposed to hang out with the other wives in the kitchen. Nevertheless, she was making incredible paintings during that period and later. And when I interviewed her, she said that practicing automatism reminded her of when she was a little girl drawing the Hebrew alphabet from right to left. Now, another figure I interviewed was the surrealist artist Gordon Onslow Ford. He was British, and he was one of the artists that the leader of surrealism, Andre Breton, embraced in Europe in the late 1930s. And then in 1942, due to World War II, a whole group of them left Europe and came to New York, which was, of course, then beginning to overtake Paris as the center of the art world. So Onslow Ford's method was to work with a vocabulary that included 3 basic forms, which he called line, circle, and dot, because he felt those were the fastest forms you could make, and hence the most purely automatic. And I show you one of his all over paintings that he made using a method similar to Pollock's, where he would pour and spill paint, but his configurations were line, circle, dot. And his imagery was basically an abstract representation of the cosmos, the universe, the collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it. All these artists were influenced by the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, who believed in archetypes and also believed in the idea that for every life there is a predetermined pattern, and that to find your path, you must recognize different cues or clues that you see around you. During this period, actually, I do thank my thesis advisor for pointing me to the philosopher Carl Wilhelm Friedrich Schlegel, who wrote, "Only he who possesses a personal religion and original view of infinity can be an artist." At the time, I had started to basically become friends with a number of LA artists who were my own generation, who were exploring their spirituality in one way or another, none of whom practiced organized religion, but found that art making was in fact their religion. So it's sort of what Friedrich Schlegel said, I saw it kind of happening before me in the LA art scene. And in fact, it was my immersion in the LA art scene that guided me in a way to not complete my PhD, partly because my thesis advisor was very slow in returning things to me. I wrote 3.5 chapters, which are now in the archives of American art, so it wasn't for nothing. And the Pollock article, of course, is where I said a lot of what I had learned from the research. One of the artists who I met during my early years in LA and working at Claremont, I should mention, I lived in Silver Lake at that time and commuted to Claremont. It was only a 45-minute drive in those days. And one of the artists who actually sent me a postcard after I reviewed a show she was in was Claire Falkenstein. And I should mention, the exhibition was called Americans in Paris, the 50s. And it was at CSUN. It was in the former gallery at CSUN. And it was mostly men and a few women. And I singled Claire out as best in show. That's me sitting with Claire there in the picture. So she sent me a postcard and I went to a panel she was on, and that's where we met. And she invited me to the studio. She had an amazing studio on Oceanfront Walk in Venice Beach. She was a true eccentric, a wonderful person. And she kind of mentored me during that period. And she used to talk about the cosmos, or the matrix, as I like to call it, as the never-ending screen. And she was also interested in duality. She would talk about the duality of structure and flow, which is basically the basic duality of geometric form versus organic form. And of course, she's very well known today for her sculptural work, where you can see in the example I'm showing, you have the sun surrounded by lines that reflect the idea of the cosmos, or the matrix, the never-ending screen, the infinite universe. Another artist who I met after I reviewed her work was the late Martha Alf, who was one of the first artists to teach me what could happen in drawing that I had no idea was possible. When I studied at Harvard at the Fogg Art Museum, I saw a lot of old master drawing. And when I encountered Alf's exhibition at New Space Gallery, which I reviewed for Arts Magazine, I was totally blown away. I didn't know contemporary artists could draw this way. And then a few years after that show, she did an exhibition of color pastel drawings with her signature image, one of her signature images, which was the pear, which she sometimes viewed, I should say not often, but sometimes viewed as a self-portrait. And this one was a tribute to an artist who had just died, Andy Wilf. She called it Pear Number One for Andy Wilf. And the first time I saw this work in an exhibition, I said to Martha, "What do you think of Caspar David Friedrich, the German romantic painter?" And she said, "Oh, I've always loved him. Why?" And I said, "Well, because the way you use light, it's the way Friedrich used light to represent spirituality. And in this image, the pear is really a stand-in for a human being. And all of her drawings of fruits and vegetables, each object is like an actor on a stage in a psychodrama. But in this one, it was sort of the solitary pear sort of looking towards the light, which is a really appropriate image for someone who had just passed. So anyway, she really proved to me that drawing can be an art form in its own right. It's not just a sketch for something else. It's something that has a life of its own, and she was a true master in the same way that Rembrandt was. And then another artist who impacted me greatly during my Claremont and early LA art scene years was the late Wallace Berman, whose credo was "Art is love is God," which I thought was a wonderful sort of mantra to operate off of while making art. His most important body of work was the Very Facts collages, which you see there on the right. What he did was he took an obsolete photocopying machine, and he could print photographic images using it, but instead of only being able to print positives, he could print negatives as well. And he would make these modules and then put them together to form larger compositions. And in each module, you see a human hand holding a transistor AM/FM radio, which was the state of the art of how we listened to our music back in those days. And the first time I saw one of these was in a show at LA Louver Gallery in Venice. And I was absolutely transfixed. It's like I went someplace else and I came back and I said to myself, "Oh, I get it. This is our universe. These are our options," which is very much in keeping with Jung and the idea of finding meaning in symbols. Berman was also very interested in the mysteries of the Kabbalah, which is the ancient Jewish doctrine of mysticism. He didn't really understand it, but he was fascinated by it. And one thing that he did understand was that according to the Kabbalah, God created the universe by uttering the Hebrew alphabet in sequence. And the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the Aleph, which he had on his motorcycle helmet. So he was a very hip artist of the Beat generation, but he was interested in Jewish mysticism, and he created a very innovative way of representing that, which really took me to another place the first time I saw it. It was during that period that I got very interested in numbers, not mathematically, but more in terms of the symbol and metaphor. And this actually came out of my interview with Lee Krasner, who told me that Jackson Pollock considered his personal number to be the number 46 because it showed up in his address in several places where he lived. So I started thinking about my number, and I came to the conclusion that it was 18, which was the day I was born on. I was born at 6 months with a fraternal male twin who died at 10 days. So I was very lucky that I made it through. I was incubated for 2 months before I was able to come home. So somehow that stood out for me. And then when I saw that Wallace Berman, who was into Jewish mysticism, was born on the 18th of February and died on the 18th of February in a car crash on his 50th birthday, I thought that was pretty interesting. I'm going to ignore that call. Let me just, yeah. So that intrigued me quite a bit. And so then I started thinking more about my number, and I suddenly realized that the address of the house I grew up in Studio City, not only had my 18, it had my whole birthday, 6/18. And then about 3 decades later, I suddenly looked at it again and realized, oh, it had my older brother's birthday in there too, 2/6. So when I look at that address, I think, well, the 1 is my parents, the 2/6 is my brother, older brother, the 6/18 is me. Sarah was my paternal grandmother's first name. That was the name of our street. And my younger brother was born in that house, so he hadn't been born yet when we moved there. So all this autobiographical stuff somehow turned up in the address where I lived in Studio City. My interest in numbers also was related to 2 exhibitions that I curated at the Claremont Colleges, where I was the assistant gallery director. The first one was called Black and White or Colors, which was a big survey exhibition of artists working only in black and white, or only in white, or only in black. And Jackson Pollock's Black and White number 20, which is in the Lackner collection, was in that show, as was this beautiful painting by Al Held, Black Nile 8. And when writing the catalog essay, I got into writing about duality, because black and white is one of the dualities. And in fact, Robert Motherwell, we had one of his Spanish elegies in that show also. And he always saw black and white as being like the dividing line between life and death. Then, sort of on the heels of that, I started noticing that a lot of Los Angeles artists were working in tripartite formats. So I curated a show called Contemporary Triptychs. You may be familiar with many of these artists who are still exhibiting today: Ed Moses, Billy Al Bankston, Joe Good, Laddie John Dill, Jim Morphesis, and Marian Estes are still very active to this day. So anyway, I ended up writing a lot about the history of the number 3 in the essay for that exhibition. I also had become very interested in, as I mentioned earlier, in LA artists who were dealing with spirituality. Jim Morphesis, who I just mentioned, is one of them. This is one of his double crucifixion images, where rather than be a narrative, the crucifixion became an emblem or a symbol of angst. Lita Albuquerque was in that show. This is a show I curated when I was the curator at the San Francisco Art Institute in the mid-'80s, which kind of summed up the interest that had begun in LA, and it continued up into the Bay Area. And I included a couple of Bay Area artists, including Eva Bavenzi, who you see this beautiful painting here. While working in San Francisco at the Art Institute, I also had the great privilege to work with Jay DeFeo, who has since become kind of legendary. The photo is from around the time that we worked together. She's another artist who demonstrated to me the power of drawing. Even though she's best known for a gigantic painting that weighs a ton called The Rose, her drawings are absolutely phenomenal. And the drawing, The Eyes from 1958, and the one below there, Figure 3, which is actually a drawing of her tripod that she used for her camera. But it's just a little section of it where it seems to fade off into nothingness. And so that made me think of this idea again of being at the point where something is midpoint between materiality and immateriality, where the negative space in the drawing is as important as the positive space. And in her drawing The Eyes, it's as if she's totally in touch with the infinite, with the collective unconscious, with the cosmos, whatever you choose to call it, where she's at one with it as the vertical lines sort of cross over her eyes. I continued my interest in spirituality. Actually, 7 years later, it was a show I had always wanted to do. And finally, when I got a position as the curator at what's now called MoCA Cleveland, I got the green light to do this exhibition, which was all about the cross. It was called Cruciformed, Images of the Cross since 1980. And so I moved from the number 3, from triptychs, to the number 4 with the cross. And it was a really wide range. And again, LA artists were in the show. This is Peter Liashkov, who's still working here today in LA, And again, Jim Morphesis with the double crucifixions. This is the African-American artist Raymond Saunders, who was from the Bay Area, although I think worked in LA at one time. Also, while I was in Cleveland, I did an exhibition, actually it was up concurrently with Cruciforms, of Allen Ginsberg's photographs of his Buddhist friends. Allen Ginsberg, of course, was the legendary beat poet who wrote Howl, in which he several times says the phrase, everything is holy, which I equate with Wallace Berman's phrase, art is love is God. That's me there with Ginsberg and Marjorie Talalay, who founded what was used to be called the Cleveland Center for Contemporary Art. And then another show that I curated in Cleveland, it actually came in direct succession to the Cross Show. The Cross Show was very well received in Cleveland, and the board, this is a rare thing, the museum's board wanted me to curate another show in that vein, and I ultimately came up with the Cross. I suddenly found myself dealing with emblems, pop culture emblems, and it led me to the American flag. There had never been a survey exhibition looking at how artists, contemporary artists, had used the flag in their work. And so it started in the 1950s and went all the way through to the early 90s, which is when I was curating the show. The installation shots here are from the Phoenix Art Museum, which is where I went following Cleveland. After Cleveland, I became the curator of 20th century art at the Phoenix Art Museum. And when this show was shown there, it was a full survey in terms of whether the art was political or not. It kind of went cold, hot, cold, hot. During the Vietnam era, the work was pretty hot. During the early 90s, due to the culture wars, the work was hot once again. And I included work from the People's Flag Show, which you see up here, which was a show that originally was held in New York City in 1970 to protest flag desecration laws. So when the show was well received in Cleveland, the following year it went to a college gallery in Colorado Springs where it was well received. But when I showed it in Phoenix, it was the first time it was at a general museum, not a contemporary art venue. And audience expectations were a bit different. And even though we did a lot of advanced preparation, we met with members of the veterans groups, we met with members of the Civil Liberties Union. We had a lot of education programming. Nevertheless, in Arizona, this became a very, very controversial show, primarily because of these two works. This is Kate Millett's The American Dream Goes to Pot, which was originally created for the People's Flag Show in New York in 1970. It was a work she made to protest the Vietnam War. And this is the work that actually made national news. Hence, it was part of the history I was documenting. It's Dred Scott's What is the Proper Way to Display the US Flag, where to answer the question by writing in the comment book here, you have to stand it on the flag. Although I saw a very clever young person put his feet to either side of the flag while he did that. We also had a table with comment books opposite the piece, so that if someone didn't want to step on the flag, they could sign it, they could write their comments in the comment books. Nevertheless, right after we opened the show, the local American Legion members came in with the TV cameras. So we had a 2-month media circus, and in all the way to NBC Nightly News, where Newt Gingrich said, you see up there, I don't have to look at a US flag in a toilet to know it's wrong. I think it's a sign of how much they don't get it. They think looking at it will make us happier. It will just make us angrier. The fact is they ought to close the exhibit, I think. Well, we didn't close it. The board stood behind the show and the museum director. It set an attendance record for that decade. And strangers came up and thanked me for doing the show. So it was quite an experience. And then during the same period, while I was in Cleveland, I came up with the idea of doing a show on the history, how rock and roll culture had influenced contemporary artists. And it was inspired by the fact that we were, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was under construction. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum was under construction. And we loaned them our galleries to show some of their Janis Joplin memorabilia. And the news cameras came, and of course, we never got that kind of coverage for our own contemporary art shows. So that led me to the idea. The original plan was to piggyback the show on the tales of piggyback it on the opening of the Rock and Roll Museum. However, I moved on to Phoenix, so I ended up pitching the show to a traveling exhibition service that was very successful in sending the show to 13 museums around the US. And here is when it came to Phoenix, a year after the old Glory controversy. Both shows brought in 50,000 visitors. They were really successful. And what I liked about them is that, you know, they were popular. They had appeal to the everyday person who was not necessarily art literate, but at the same time, they were full of contemporary art scholarship. I did a lot of research. I wrote catalogs and so forth. Of course, you can see some Jeff Koons's Michael Jackson and Bubbles there that was in the show. Okay, so moving forward, after Phoenix, I moved on to the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans. And shortly before I moved there, I forgot, this is actually from right before I left Phoenix to New Orleans. So it was about the time I was moving to New Orleans, where I had met Al Held. I proposed him twice for the Venice Biennale. He wasn't chosen both times, either time. But I wrote the catalog essay for his show in New York, and that picture of us together is from his 2000 show at Robert Miller Gallery in New York, and that was when I just started working at the CAC in New Orleans. And I, of course, proposed doing a show for Al in New Orleans of his late paintings, the paintings he'd been doing from the late 90s till the time he died in the mid 2000s. He was, of course, still alive at the time we did the show, and he was very influential on me. He was interested in string theory. He was looking at the universe from a scientific vantage point. He claimed that there was nothing about spirituality in his work, but I think if you have a spiritual perspective, you can certainly take that away from the work. This is one of my favorite paintings. It's something like 8 feet by 8 feet. It's really large. And what's wonderful is that there's multiple points of entrance. He used the term non-gravitational multidimensional space to refer to the space of these works. And he as I mentioned, was interested in string theory. I forgot, there was another phrase I was going to mention, but it escapes me for the moment. And then moving forward in time, in terms of one of the pinnacles of my career as a curator, was in 2010 when I had moved on to the San Antonio Museum of Art, where I curated an exhibition called Psychedelic, Optical and Visionary Art since the 1960s. And it was actually inspired by this Frank Stella painting, which is in the Sama collection. When I first saw it, I just said to myself, that's the most psychedelic Stella I've ever seen. It's painted in Decolo paints, and it was painted in 1968, which was the height of the psychedelic era. That's a Vazzarelli painting here in the background. Alex Gray, Fred Tomaselli, and these were some local artists who were in the show. So that was kind of like the pinnacle of my curatorial career. We produced a book for the show. And I also did an artist conversation with Alex Gray, who I discovered while I was working on the show was kind of a cult hero for younger audiences. And in fact, we had young people lined up out the door and around the block for that event. You can see it on YouTube. There's a channel called the David S. Rubin Artist Conversations at the San Antonio Museum of Art. And it's also on Alex Gray's website. Okay, so although I devoted 40 years of my life to being a full-time curator, I was always making art in one way or another. During my LA years when I was teaching and running assistant directing the galleries at Claremont, I started exploring oil pastel at the suggestion of a local artist. And I had a lot of fun with it, but I found it to be too messy for my taste. These two little drawings made in oil pastel were done while I was working in San Francisco in the mid 80s. I just used my fingers and kind of moved it around very quickly, not thinking what I was doing. And the one on the right, I scratched into it with my fingernails and came up with these images. But then by the time I was working in Cleveland, I really put art making on the back burner, because at that point I was in a high profile position as a curator and I had plenty to do. And it was actually a very creative outlet. I really feel that every time I've installed a show, it was a form of an artwork anyway. Okay, so to talk about my own work, I used to take vacations in Amsterdam for my summer vacation. I would stay there for up to 2 weeks and pretend I lived there. And this is a suite of some little drawings I made in a small sketchbook on one of those trips in 1997. And it was interesting, when I was living in San Antonio, an artist friend was thinking about organizing an exhibition on duality and wanted to know if I had anything. And I remembered these little drawings because essentially they were about different forms of duality. My idea of duality is that there's to be many variations within one thing. So to me, these were all about my having been born with a fraternal twin, because in these dualistic images, none of the counterparts are identical. They're similar, but somehow different, even though they're connected. So it was one of the first times I felt that I was dealing with my own history as a twin in my drawings. Then in New Orleans is where I really got serious about my work and returned to drawing, and did so on an ongoing basis. When I showed some of the work I had done in the sketchbooks from Amsterdam to a New Orleans artist, Blake Boyd, he went out and bought me a sketchbook with paper that was better than the paper I was working on. So I said, well, now I need to get serious. So I started drawing in that sketchbook. This would have been in the summer of 2001, in July. And I kind of devoted some time almost every night, when I was home anyway, to doing these drawings. And I began initially with gel pens, which I've since rejected. I like studio pens better. But in the beginning, I was just exploring. And when I drew this drawing, I didn't know what it was about. It just seemed so ominous to me. And then the next morning, the Twin Towers fell. And I thought, oh my God, I picked up on something. And so in hindsight, I wrote premonition into this drawing, which I drew on the evening of 9/10 of 2001. And that was followed a few days later, the Sunday after 9/11, by this drawing. I was drawing at very close range. I was drawing very quickly. I wasn't thinking about what I was drawing. I was just making forms. And then when I held it back and looked at it, I realized it's as if the character from Munch's The Scream had started running and screaming. And so I wrote no words at the bottom of the image. And again, it was a very direct response, although from my unconscious, to the events of 9/11. Then this followed with a drawing that I called Battered Hope. And in the next drawing, I introduced the image of the candle, which of course in Jewish tradition, you always bless with the candle, or a pair of candles, of course, in most services, but it's a symbol of renewal and rebirth. And then I just kept going. And so I titled a few of them. The one on the left I called Lifesaver, because this little image at the top reminded me of a Lifesaver candy. This one I titled Manuscript, because it reminded me of medieval manuscripts and the manuscript illuminations. And they got very, very dense. The one on the left, which is in the collection of the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, I called Path of the Pinball, because it reminded me of the levers on the old pinball machines, which when I was a kid, of course, we all played with pinball machines. It was before video gaming existed. And the one on the right, I called Bourbon Street, because it reminded me of the kind of seedy atmosphere of Bourbon Street in New Orleans. And I was living in the French Quarter, which I lived in a quiet section of the French Quarter, so I never heard any of it. But if I wanted to walk 5 or 6 blocks, I could, see all the action. And then what happened at a certain point was I kind of had to bust the billiards open. To go back for 1 second to these, they were really dense. And there was one that was even much darker in palette. And I thought, boy, there's nowhere to go except to open this up, which is the same thing Al Held did in his progression in the 1960s when he moved from his abstract expressionist paintings that were very flat to his more geometric paintings where he opened up the space. So, and also, I know my work as a curator always has influenced my work as an artist. And I was installing a show at the CAC that we brought in. It was a traveling show called Comic Release. And it was all humorous work. So I found I was doing caricatures in a sense, light-hearted things relating to what I had done in the earlier work. And these are two from that period, one that I actually drew on Easter Sunday, and the other one, A Jeweled Aesthetic, which really informs the work I'm doing now. And it's when I first started, again, unconsciously, drawing Mardi Gras beads. Because every year, of course, in New Orleans, we have the Mardi Gras, and all of us end up with piles and piles of Mardi Gras beads. They're everywhere. They're littered all over the street, especially Bourbon Street. But if you just have a bunch of them, you know, I had a bunch of them in my apartment and I would hold them in my hand, and they were just beautiful to look at. And when I was doing research for an exhibition on the African-American artist Willie Birch, I read up a little bit on not Afro-Cuban, but African-American history, Afro-Caribbean history, that's what it was, Afro-Caribbean history and culture. And I learned that Mardi Gras beads were often left at grave sites to ward away the evil spirits. So I like that idea as well. So moving forward, still in New Orleans, by this time, 2004, I left the sketchbook and started working on larger paper. This is on 14 by 17 inch Bristol paper here, which is a smooth surface, which means I can work rapidly. It's very smooth to the touch. And this is a drawing that I kept for myself. You can see where the negative space is a large part of it. Like Jay DeFeo, it's just a little section. And I ended up calling this one Lifeline because it made me think of my own progression. And at the time, I really believed that this little section here that is illuminated by one little pearlescent bead was my New Orleans period. I was still there, I hadn't left yet. The reason I left, of course, was after Hurricane Katrina, I could no longer do the kind of programming that I was hired to do there. So I left when I got the job offer in San Antonio, which I think is this period here. And I think that this here is where I am now in my lifeline as a septuagenarian working as a semi-retired person out of my home in Los Angeles, my birthplace. And then this on the right, also from 2004, is called Pollinating. I named it because it just reminded me of organic things growing and forming. By the way, Jackson Pollock's favorite book was called On Growth and Form. So that was very influential on him as well, the idea of organic growth. And just some other ones I did while still in New Orleans here. I moved to San Antonio by here. This one I called Kabbalah 2, as I mentioned. Berman was very interested in the Kabbalah, and I am too, although I don't claim to understand it. And then this one here, good. The other phrase from Al Held was everything is interconnected and constantly expanding. So I recognized that my imagery was about interconnectivity and how everything is interconnected in the constantly expanding universe. So this was kind of my way of articulating what Al Held had been articulating in his work from 2006. And then also from 2006, this was the cover image of my first solo show. We used this for the mailer, which was in San Antonio at Blue Star Contemporary Art Museum. Excuse me. And I titled it Divinity is Everywhere, because for me, divinity is light. It's a rephrasing of Ginsberg's Everything is Holy, and essentially Berman's Art is Love is God. One reason I equate light with divinity is that as a child, of course, I attended Hebrew school, Sunday school and Hebrew school in North Hollywood at a place that was called Valley Jewish Community Center. And in the Jewish synagogue, there's an eternal light over the pulpit, which symbolizes the idea of God or divinity as being everlasting. And then, in fact, when I used to teach about the art of Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman and the use of light in their work, I always felt that it had a connection with the eternal light in the Jewish synagogue, since although they were non-practicing Jews, they were both of Jewish heritage, as am I, a non-practicing Jew of Jewish heritage. And then this one on the right was in a show in Houston called Oz in 2008. And then this one, Journey, is one of my favorites. I kept it for myself. It reminded me sort of Star Wars and journeying through the universe. And so the white of the paper becomes, you know, the unknown. I should mention I was in a show, a group show in New York in 2005, where it was called Cursive, because my mark making is a kind of like handwriting. It is, in many respects, it's an extension of my handwriting. And a couple of years later, by that time I was in San Antonio, the same group of artists, we were invited to show in Hong Kong. Well, I wasn't about to travel there, and I didn't want to really invest in sending you know, these larger works to Hong Kong. So I sent miniatures, a group of 4x6 drawings, and I sent them on binder clips to be hung that way. And I got mentioned in a review in a Hong Kong newspaper where the critic thought that my negative space was as sensuous as my positive space. So I was really happy that he got the importance of that, that if somehow if you draw something a certain way, it doesn't only activate the drawing itself, it activates the background at the same time. And then the one on the right from 2012, once again, I felt that that had to do with my twin. And then Whirlwind from 2012 and Goodwill Basket from 2012. They would be named arbitrarily after the fact, which is what Motherwell and all the other abstract expressionists would do. And at that time, I was clustering my pearls, call them pearls because they're pearlescent, my Mardi Gras beads or whatever you want to call them together. When I draw, I feel like I'm drawing trajectories through the universe, virtually stringing the beads and interlacing them and interweaving them. And then from 2013, Magic Hammock, and 2014, Safety Net. And here you can see the yellow brush pen is starting to become more prominent, although I hadn't yet recognized how integral, how central, how important that yellow brush pen would be to my practice. That wouldn't come until after I moved back to LA. It also appears, you can see a little bit in this one called Abundance. And this was one of the very first drawings I did on the 19 by 24 inch scale, which all of the drawings, larger drawings in the current show are on that scale. But again, I was still kind of building an image. It's almost like a Claire Falkenstein sculpture translated into drawing format. And again, as I was saying, I feel like I'm drawing flat progressions, trajectories. I turn the paper as I'm working, I'll draw a little bit one way, then I'll turn it another way, and then turn it upside down. I'm not really keeping track of which way I'm turning it, but I draw from all four sides. In other words, when I draw into the composition or across the composition, and I draw two-dimensionally, laterally, bead by bead by bead by bead. And it all eventually forms an image that when you look at it, we perceive it as three-dimensional. And this is some of the earlier 19 by 24 inch drawings, which I which I exhibited as a triptych. They just seem to work really well together. I called it Crescendo numbers 1, 2, and 3 in 2016. And then this is the only time I did a 4-panel drawing using 18 by 12 inch size drawings on watercolor paper. I mentioned that some of my drawings are on Bristol or Bristol vellum, which is smooth and I work quickly. What I like about watercolor, which I also love working on, is that the ink saturates really well. And so you get a more lush image because of the way the ink actually, you know, soaks into the paper as you're drawing. And this one is called Ambulatory, The Joys of Movement. And it was in a show in a couple of years ago. It was after I moved back home to LA. And I was invited to show my work at the Bradbury Art Museum at the University of Arkansas, Arkansas State University, Jonesboro. And after the show, they called me and said they wanted to buy this work. So I was very pleased about that. Okay, then after moving back to LA, I started basically increasing the size of my images. The one I called Resilience in 2017 was done right here where I'm sitting at this desk. And I called it resilience because my transition back home, the way it happened was in 2014, I had been at SAMA for 7.5 years and had great success with my programming. And of course, the psychedelic exhibition was enormously popular. But sometimes when a new director comes into a museum, this is very common in the field. And I'm actually very lucky it didn't happen to me a lot, because it does happen a lot to curators. A new director has their own agenda and they decide they're going to clean house. And so a new director came in 2012 and didn't really let us know until 2014 when she brought in her own chief curator that she was going to get rid of some of the curators and have her own shop. So it was not a pleasant experience, but of course I bounced back from it, as we all do when we face what we call a rough patch. One of the things that really helped me with that was the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institution approached me about collecting my curatorial papers. And that made me realize that, it took my focus off of San Antonio and put my focus back on my 40 years as a curator. So if you want to know more about my curatorial history, there's a guide to my curatorial papers on the website of the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian. And if you're doing research on anything that I might have researched, you can request my notes or whatever is cataloged in their collection. So, and then here, Untitled from 2019, this is when I finally understood what I could do with the yellow brush pen, because it makes my bead formations, which by the way, you can see them as cells, you could read them as whatever you want. But I like the idea of beads, and because of my New Orleans experience, which I still consider the Camelot of my curatorial career. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, I was surrounded by the most wonderful group of artists. There was a real sense of community, and they were the ones who encouraged me to make my own art. So it was the Camelot. Hurricane Katrina changed all that. And then to get to the current series, Pearls of Wisdom, by this point, I was posting my work on Instagram, and I started calling some of these either Crown or Tree of Life Arbol de la Vida in my Instagram postings. The Crown, of course, I was watching the Netflix series, and I had never realized the role of Queen Elizabeth as the spiritual head of the country. And since my work represents my concept of divinity, the idea that divinity is in everything, even the matrix that is the universe, in other words. And my jeweled aesthetic, which reminded me of the jewels on a crown, I would sometimes call them Crown if they reminded me of a crown, or Tree of Life, Arbol de la Vida, which is a very big tradition in Mexican culture, and living and working for for 7.5 years, but living for 10.5 years in San Antonio. I was very familiar with that. So it also reminded me of that. But then at a certain point, I changed it all to Pearls of Wisdom, which I had used as a title a couple of times, because I realized that's what's important to me. The idea of the innate human quest that we have to gain knowledge. And in fact, in the artist statement that appears on the web, it's not on the wall because I didn't think of it till we were ready to write a press release. But I came up with the idea that we are given the tree of life at birth, but we have to build the tree of knowledge from the ground up. So in a way, I feel each little pearl or bead or whatever you want to call it in my drawings represents a little pearl of wisdom. And I think we have to really relish those things, particularly in this time we're living in, when education is being diminished in the media and by the right-wing media and the right-wing politicians. They don't care about knowledge. And in fact, as you know, they spread disinformation. So to me, knowledge is holy, it's divine, it's what we should all strive for. And I think in the more recent work, I really found my true personal meaning in my drawings. And they can mean whatever they want to anybody else, but for me, that's what they ultimately mean. Now, the other bodies of work that I'm showing in the current exhibition are the little date drawings that I've been doing in the journals. And what happened was, I went to Amsterdam. I can't remember if I already said this or not, but I went to Amsterdam in 2018. I was real sick when I left with a stomach problem. It was 80-degree heat, so I turned around and came back the next day and decided rather than do the date drawings only on vacation, I would do them full time, like Ankawara did. He didn't do drawings, he did paintings. Ankawara was an amazing artist. You can see an installation of his work if you're ever up in New York and go to the Dia Beacon. To me, his installation was the most powerful for me personally and most meaningful installation in the Dia Beacon, because when I stand in front of these paintings, I just start thinking about time and the miracle of time and what was happening on that particular day and how every day is different and how every day is blessed. And they were like daily blessings for him, like a Zen meditation. And he also stored each painting in a box with the New York Times from that particular day. And then I was also inspired to do these photographic tableaux that you see, 6 of them in the exhibition, because the late Martha Alf was doing these extraordinary photographic tableaux in her little studio apartment in assisted living during the last year of her life. And she would each day, she actually couldn't move them around herself because she was kind of frail, but she had a helper move them around as she would build these compositions and photograph them every day and post them on Instagram. So I started doing the same thing. Now, initially, they were just documentation. These are some of the early ones. But then, as you see by this point, which is around where I started with the work in this exhibition, they were becoming more artworks on their own, photographic tableau. And then at a certain point, I realized I had the digital or the analog clock sitting on my desk right where I do my drawings. And I put it, it was another form of numbers. A number asked time, of course, a calendar date is time, the time on a clock is time. So I began incorporating them. And then a little further down the line in 2020, probably shortly before COVID started. Yeah, this one I'm showing here is from January 7th, so it's a little bit before COVID. I noticed I also have my digital blood pressure monitor sitting on the same table where I'm making the drawings. And that's another, it's not really time, but it's another statistic about me and my life. And I take my blood pressure every morning when I get up. So it's not taken at the time I take the photo, but I started working them into the compositions. And then I just started going to town. And so like the blood pressure cord, for example, becomes a really interesting linear element, as does the ribbon in the journals. So you'll see these as well in the current exhibition. And so that's what I'm doing at the present moment. I draw every day. I date drawing in the little journals every day. And I create a photographic tableau that I post on Instagram, which I haven't done yet today, but I will do when we finish this conversation. And finally, if you want to follow what I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram at David S. Rubin Art. Okay, so now let me close this out. And we're back. Erica?
Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. That was really informative and just so interesting. Do any of you have any questions for David?
I do.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about when the term visionary art came around, and if that was like a shift or if that was just like a label that came up to describe something that was already happening.
Well, visionary, I think, is a term that art historians have used for decades. To me, visionary art just means that you're depicting something that doesn't exist, that you see it, that it's your vision. I know it's interesting because when I was While I was already a working curator, I took what was used to be called the Museum Management Institute. It's now called the Getty Leadership Institute. And I took it in the summer of '89 when it was held in Berkeley, on the Berkeley campus, UC Berkeley. And one of the first things they talked to us about was visioning. That as curators or museum director or registrar, whatever your position was, it's important to have a vision and pursue your vision. So in the curatorial world, they actually use the term visioning, meaning seeing into the future, having some kind of vision about what is possible. So I think it's very similar in visionary art. If you're a painter and you're painting an image of something that doesn't exist but could exist, you're visioning, you're seeing beyond what we normally see. And that's what visionary is. And visionary imagery is imagery that comes from visioning.
Thank you.
Sure. Any more questions? I see another hand up. Yeah. Well, Milena, is that your name? You have a question?
Yes, hi. My question was, you referenced the automatic drawings, and there's also a term called automatic writings. I don't know if you're familiar with.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
So do you feel like when you're creating your art, do you feel like it's coming from somewhere else and you're like a vessel that's just kind of, putting it to paper,
Yeah.
or do you feel like it's conscious decision that you're making when you're creating it?
Well, like Robert Motherwell, I think it's a mix. I mean, there's a part where the part that's not predetermined, that I'm not thinking about. I don't think about what direction I'm going to draw in. I mean, I have a kind of set vocabulary that evolved over a number of years that I'm really happy with, because I'm just able to go to town when I do it. But and I also should mention I work to music. There's a rhythmic quality in my work that comes, and people say, well, what music do you listen to? Well, I listen to pop music. I grew up in the Valley. I was weaned on top 40, but not necessarily the pop music of today's younger generation. But in any case, but I listen to music that I've loved my whole life and that's been part of my life. And so I just get into the flow. So what I'm really following is the rhythm, maybe. And so the image is not predetermined. I don't have an image. I don't say, oh, this is interesting, I'm going to draw it. Or here's a glass, I'm going to make a picture of the glass. It's not like that. It's a kind of free form approach to making imagery. And
almost feels meditative or something, kind of like a meditation.
It is like a meditation, but it's not a Zen-like meditation for me.
Right.
It's more joyful because I listen to music that I like.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Kent, did you have another question? Yeah.
Unmute myself. Hi. I had a question, more of a formal question. I mean, your vocabulary, obviously, I was wondering, especially with some of your recent larger drawings, like in the show or that you showed, and you have this unique way of, keeping things out is just as important as putting things in. And how do you edit, for instance, some of the earlier pieces that you showed, like, I don't know, I guess New Beginning and No Words, are some of the ones that were really full before you broke the billiards, so to speak.
Right.
So how many drawings, or not how many, but do some of your drawings not make the cut? Or do you say, oh no, this one's not working, but this one is, and then someone, the average layperson or someone even close to you was like, oh no, that one, I don't understand why this one didn't make it. Like, do you ever ruin them? Do you ever cannibalize them? Or is it just one shot and that's it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Lee Krasner cannibalized, as you may know. She would cut apart old paintings she didn't like and make drawings out of them.
Absolutely.
Actually, I haven't been exhibiting long enough to have that be a problem for me. So I mean, the short answer is no, I don't edit them. I just let them happen. There's a certain point where I feel comfortable with the weight. It's like I feel the weight of the drawing. It's the same thing when I install a show. I feel the weight of everything. And it feels right, you know. As I say, I used to be proud of the fact that I could do them all in one session, but when they became more complex, it's like I'll do a little section, and it's also the way I write. I'm a morning writer. I'm not a morning drawer, but I'm a morning writer, and I could write like a couple of paragraphs, and then I got to put it aside till tomorrow, you know, and then I come back and I'm fresh and I write again. So when I'm ready to get, you know, when my psyche's ready to get into that place, we all call it going into the zone when we draw. So when I get into that place, I'm kind of looking at the paper and I'm following my hand's lead in a sense. I'm watching my hand as I'm moving, boom, 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 you know, beep, 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 you know, and then I make a movement and then I make a counter movement. And then there's an empty spot here, so I fill in the empty spot. And then I feel like, you know, it's intense when I do it. So I feel like, whoa, you know, that's all I can do for now. And then like, it's like adding appendages now, you know, I'll realize, okay, now let's, you know, there's, I'll take it over and look at some of the finished works and hold it next to it, because, I mean, sometimes I want them to be, I mean, sometimes they look great when you haven't worked them very far, as you know, but also I try to encourage myself to keep going further, knowing I can still do that I can still get a good result, even though this earlier result is wonderful and I like it. I recently did one that was a little lighter. I just thought, no, and I got a lot of likes on it on Instagram and Facebook, you know, so, you know, it's interesting. We have that instant feedback mechanism now, but I don't think I've gone beyond 4 sessions in terms of a particular drawing. And when I filled the amount of space where I feel there's a nice, comfortable relationship between the so-called positive and so-called negative space. And so your eye, you know, it's interesting. A fellow artist who was at my show with me last Sunday commented that, you know, I told him, I can't tell you where I started. I can never tell you where I started. And you know, it's like there's no beginning or end to them. And because he asked me about that. And it's just once I feel like, you know, I filled in all the spaces, you know, I'm sure I could still fill in more, but there's a certain point where I feel like it resonates. I mean, you know, I want them to come alive. And other people who've seen the show have mentioned to me that, you know, you can't get it fully from a reproduction, which is why I encourage people to see the show, you know, while it's up, because, oh, and one of the things that I started doing recently, again, with these little rays of light around individual beads. And I don't do them for every bead either. I like the idea of flux. In fact, I'm a big fan of the painter Ross Flechter, of his paintings, because he varies texture so that it's not even all the way across. There is this feeling of flux that comes from the fact that some of the painted areas are thicker and some of the painted areas are thinner. And it helps your eye move around the whole thing. And that's what I want them to do. I want them to have this feeling of energy. I mean, that's another thing. I see them as energy. You know, they're basically representation. And, you know, there was a book on Jackson Pollock that I studied years ago by Bernard Friedman called Energy Made Visible. So that stuck with me because I feel that's what I'm doing too. It's my energy. It's the energy of the movement when I draw on the page. And then it's just a depiction of what energy looks like according to David Rubin, you know. So that's what it is. So Erica, is there anybody else with any questions?
Does anyone else have any questions for David?
A question. Hi David, thank you for your presentation. What's your advice for artists who want to, in terms of writing, who want to talk about the spiritual and even like the religious side of work in a world that's seemingly becoming more secular? So how do you bring that into the conversation now in your writing when you talk about it?
If it's personal to you, say it, write it. When I first started championing the artists who were addressing spirituality in the early 80s, it wasn't well received by everybody. Christopher Knight really panned my triptych show. He said, belief in this show at Pomona College requires a huge leap of faith. So you just take that with a grain of salt. I mean, you have to, your art is about you. It has to be about who you are, what's important to you, and you know, and how you want to express that. And of course, when you talk about what the art means to you, you know, that's what it means to you. I think I made a comment in my presentation to that point that, you know, other people can get other things from my art. That's fine. I remember once I moderated a panel in San Francisco with the late Joan Brown, who was a great figurative artist and who got very heavy into spirituality in her work in the later years. In fact, like Wallace Berman, who was also in spirituality, she had a mystical death as well. She was installing an installation in a temple in India, and the balustrade fell on her. I mean, it was unbelievable. But she talked about the importance of meaning and symbolism. And I mean, she was fearless. And I just think, be fearless with your work and who you are. I mean, you know, we're all different in this world. You know, you have to accept the fact that the world is an amalgam of, you know, lots of different types of people with lots of different views, and the tide will go one way or another. But spirituality was not widely accepted in contemporary art in the early 80s when I was late 70s and early 80s when I got real interested in it and met artists my own age who were real interested. So that, of course, we kind of gave one another validation. So also, if you know other artists who are interested in the same kinds of ideas, or just people who aren't artists, you know, people you can talk about these things with them about these issues that are meaningful to you, don't let that stop you. You have to do what's important for you, because art is an expression of you, not anybody else. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Go back to Erica.
Yeah, anyone else? I think that's a wonderful advice, David. One thing that I've been thinking about is, gosh, there's a sociologist, I can't remember his name at the moment, but he talks about the act of co-creation with the work, and a lot of the things that you have been talking about with kind of this, you know, connection with the universe. I think a lot about the act of co-creation with the work, where it's like this back and forth conversation, and not really having, you know, the predetermination or something that you're putting on the work, rather letting it come back to you. And I think that's a really beautiful thought, and it does shine through in the drawing. So I really do encourage everyone, if you haven't as of yet been to see the show, come see it. We're here. And if you're not on campus at the times we're open, just email me, and I'm more than happy always to open the gallery up for students to come in and see it when you're available. But are there any other final questions for David? No. Well, David, I really can't thank you enough for doing this and for taking the time out of your day. I know it's your drawing time, so I want to make sure that you get some time to do that today. But thank you all for being here. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in person and seeing the show. And David will actually be at the gallery this Sunday from 1 to 3, in case you want to meet him in person and see the show at the same time.
Thank you so much, Erica, for organizing, and thank you, David. It was wonderful to have it, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you again. It's great to be back in the Valley.
All right, well.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see everybody. I'm so glad you're all here, and we'll talk on Monday. How's that?
Thank
That's
you.
good. Enjoy your day. Thanks again, Erica.
Thank you.